I'd like to begin by first wishing you all a very good morning and showing you that we'll continue from where we left off yesterday.
니지 냠내데 니지 냠내 사면은 상에 가서 쉬는 날씨 니지 사변데 아주냐 핑계 미래지 사라도 미래된 핑계 연된데 아니 개별나 신다 상변은 시 이거지 나라에 대한 니지는 신이 되고 니지의 문제조인스那这就是跟业余原点的，细节原点是细节变化生的东西，但是，不是就吃点可以，但是这能处理啊，那就，那好像是说就是那这个那的这，那就，啊，这像什么呢？你们真也知道。你们经济这个呢，因为我经济没对吧？现在，那细里面的人性了，那吃面了对吧？吃面水中都有。另一上呢，他年纪差的啊，年纪不了的，但是这他这个特别。
With regard to the practice of compassion, as I mentioned yesterday, the seed of compassion is innate within all of us, which is to say that our basic nature is fundamentally good, virtuous, and compassionate. These things are attributes of the very ground of our being. Nevertheless, in the way we experience things, these attributes and that ground itself appear to be obscured by adventitious or secondary stains or obscurations. These stains, however, do not affect the goodness of the nature itself. To give you an analogy, it's like the relationship between the sun and the clouds that temporarily veil or obscure it. Although from our point of view the sun's light is obscured by those clouds, the sun in its nature, the sun in itself, is unaffected by their presence or absence, and it always retains its potential brilliance. In that way, compassion as a seed is innate within all beings.
나머지는 왜 디신님을 선물다 상계님고 디신님고 안전 중립을 선물 다 디신제 단체에 결의를 시려 아니 디신님보야 민간 남자야 디신이다 아니 가서 네 가서 지금 양해를 대화 그 상계의 두지였어. 상계의 두지. 아주 이제 상계의 두지 선언을 하지. 네들이 상계에게 두지래야 예대에 고통을 주서는 아들이 동민이신 거지. 아들이 이제 아주 사려 주리어를 지 20년을 성도. 아, 근데 일단은 같이 내 로스타지에서 야하게 공주슈로 나가래. 같이 가셔야 처음에는 아주 친구를 나서는 되게 소수주거든요. 이미 뭐 이제 돌아야 내랑이 되어서 캡신 좁았을 때잖아. 나 춘이 위주로지. 뭐 언제야 참이 캡신 쪽에 나지. 이제 뭐 위주로지야. 좀 나도 그냥 소수적으로 권한 대상입니다. 근데 나 내를 춘이 위주지. 뭐 위주로 앉아야 캡이야. 근데 이 소로 나 저거를 이제 하나 나도 어디 춘이 왜 생각하세요? 건데 제가 이제 얘네 다가도 나왔어요. 근데 이 시즌이 아주 지났어요. 자, 뭐 현재 소리냐지? 어제 나대에 대해서 소리하네. 이제
in the Buddhist tradition, this fundamental ground of being or nature is commonly referred to as Sugata Garbha or Buddha nature. And this is sometimes also referred to in the same tradition by many synonymous terms such as suchness or thatness, natural nirvana, the compassion of all Buddhas, and emptiness endowed with an essence of compassion. This is present within each and every one of us as the very ground of our being. I think this idea, which we find in the Buddhist tradition, is very similar to the corresponding idea in the Indian Hindu tradition of Vishnu as the all-pervasive ground of being. One difference one could note is the ascription of a form to this all-pervasive ground in one tradition and the absence of such an ascription in the other. But the idea of an all-pervasive perfection as the ground of being seems very similar. In the Buddhist tradition, this is also called dharmata, the nature of all things, and sometimes specifically luminous dharmata. This is all-pervasive and always retains the potential for freedom from temporary obscurations.
that the sabe 상계의 내가 사변의 개발을 채워라 가르쳐 버렸어. 아 맞아 인지도 고요서래. 똥니도 왜 싫어해 봤던 게 안데 대화시에 니모디 배 가수르다베 다 지메 차담 제바 세네지 유엔데 용수 저거지 어제 연구에는 송부 다 그러셨다 담지 김에 그만 떠오르마 니지기 배 체매배다 윤된 폐야 여버디 배 슈르버디 가르geb디 어르스나 니지 슈 잡댕에르지 다나지지 아주 디스오르다 돈람리아 이 개바 자면 숨도 쏘사세 숨고르바 다 개바 자면 숨도 쏘사사데 다 지당하로 진다 롤 마셔를 주바 다 임비는 니지기 다 뉴바세나라도 그 슈르버디 아니 겐체 윤두산에 아니 개바 자면 숨도 지 쏘사이나 고디 가서지 드리서죠 개망의 유인다 조망 같아 자가 왜내 강아야 안 집어매어디 저저 닝지리아라네디 유스래 레인두산에 다도는 니지냐네디 예베기나 아주지 가르쳐다지 대대지 사변디 상계 윤대 사변 체매매 봐도 야게 치네 나 다르베 가르쳐는 지구 배 초도 교와도 타야요 되지 있어서
Given the presence of this seed within us, how do we cause this innate potential for the qualities of Buddhahood to grow and develop? Principally, I think, through the development of compassion. We regard the wisdom of Buddhahood, including the wisdom which correctly realizes emptiness and so forth, as the result of a process of development that is impelled, empowered, and fueled by compassion. It is the expansion of that compassion, the development of that compassion, which forms the main object of the long path which culminates in Buddhahood, which path we are told takes 3 immeasurable kalpas or aeons to complete. This inconceivably long period of time is cultivated or practiced and undergone through the power of compassion. And it is the gradually developing and perfecting compassion of the Bodhisattva that gives them the courage to be undiscouraged, regardless of how long, how many kalpas it will take to achieve Buddhahood, undiscouraged regardless of how many beings there are to be brought to liberation and Buddhahood, and undiscouraged regardless of how much effort and difficulty it takes to bring those beings to liberation. All of this tremendous, even inconceivable courage comes from the development of compassion, and therefore we regard the final fruition, Buddhahood, as a result of that compassion. Oh, jamba gomba ke abisama lamkara.
네, 아직 걔를 증지에 증주에는 도다.
지금 말에 얘는 게 롱대죠. 그러면요.
네, 년도 상계된 남 투왕계 상계 전주선 발레 중시. 是吧?
네.
나 ninji는 니즈면도 유샤다. 다들 년도 상계 증는 비슷해서 년도랑 상계는 아니 상계기 손이 개발해 상계 취지고로 거르되네. 에너지 가사 년도다랑 게는 좋아라서. 다 하나지 상계디 간에 좋아라서나 상계 전주 선발 내종시. 아 상계 전주 선발 내종시. 다 된대 전주 그 셈대야. 아니 니즈면서 도사나 아니 니지 자와지. 아니 니지를 되는 좋아인 봐. 단도라지 년도 상계되는 도안해줘. 도안데 전주쌤도 줘. 전주쌤 닝지를 되는 줘. 근데 닝지 때문에 아주 자외자와로 차는 거.
In Maitreya's Abhisamaya Lankara, he says that the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas arise from the speech of the sage, from the teachings of the Buddha. But the Buddha himself, the sage, arises from a bodhisattva. And bodhisattvas arise...
bodhicitta.
Bodhicitta. Oh, so from bodhicitta, which itself arises from compassion. What this
Bodhisattva.
Bodhisattva. Yeah. It was bodhisattva. And bodhisattvas arise from compassion. So what this means is that repeat it? Okay. In the Abhisamaya Lankara of Maitreya, he says that the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas are born from or arise from the speech of the sage, the Buddha. And the Buddha arises from a bodhisattva, and the bodhisattvas arise from compassion.
Bodhicitta is arise.
That
those lamna yabudu.
Lasa.
Chanju sambasade, chanju system gabardin chunga. Chanju system gabati, ninjele dene chunga.
So now we're back to bodhicitta. So, and the Buddha arises from bodhicitta.
No.
Buddha arises from bodhisattva, which arises from bodhicitta, which arises from compassion. Yeah. Okay. So we have both. I'll start from the beginning because Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas arise from the speech of the Buddha, the sage, the Buddha. The Buddha or Buddhas arise from or come from bodhisattvas who arise from bodhicitta, which arises from compassion. Now let me check it before it goes. This is nerve-wracking. The meaning of this is that the wisdom and attainment of disciples of the Buddha, such as Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, of course come from the Buddha's teachings. But the Buddha, including his teachings, arises from his having been a bodhisattva. And bodhisattvas arise from their generation of bodhicitta, which arises from compassion. Therefore, we can say, based on the authority of that quotation, that compassion is the very root of all of these qualities and achievements.
Marda yanjidan chanju samsa dihe geba gaya ba to so sa shiwa di gar jidang da jajön ba da ji ka shwe ro chande gi chane geba sha me de ro chayen dibi chane sta geba me de ta yundeng chane geba ba ji sim but diba chewe chane sta geba me de yor ji sim 마당이 딩게지 년도에 로시오다. 근데 주산에 나 고랑주를 바지지 전주선배 소리 챙기 민기 따바로다. 안에다지 가서 개발자를 초사하고 들이 송으로와. 제가 바지지 가서에 아니 년도에 로리네야 지지다 티신에 시합은 신다 티신 섬을 마하야나 시합은 신지 엔다 디 수직 자좀 시험에비네 다데 조조로 연구 있으래.
In fact, we find the term bodhisattva applied to those who seek Buddhahood, even in the scriptures and sutras of the common vehicle of Buddhism. That it is taught that those bodhisattvas gather the accumulations of merit and wisdom for a period of 100 kalpas in order to achieve Buddhahood. The state of that Buddhahood is taught in the common vehicle to be no different from the state of an arhat in terms of its freedom from obscuration. Now, there is not the details about the path of a bodhisattva that we find in the scriptures of the Mahayana, but the term bodhisattva itself is found in the common vehicle as well.
로탐제기 심균의 유예대회 직가초에다 대신시베 닝보왕 안에 다 주마세 롱기차 되게 다 가초에다 다 주마세 롱기 대지수네 바서만 되게 다 공배하다 니지를 조라래 레샤 제가 닌지 되게 뉴스안에 다 아주지 닌지사데 정이 딱 가상 쉬는시 시럽기 조사하는 미 니지 현대를 미버 세븐나시 다디 니지 사등에 가서 쉬는시 랑외에 삼담에 있는 가나도 삼담에 거의 한배 조사 남자 잡아 전주 톱네 배지 코알 타다네 배 가서 시신이 코알 잡아면 시신이를 배 쳐야로 근데지게 돼 공부하는 면부터 아지래도 아니 현장 봐 생활 봐 상담이는 배지 메롱은 뭐니 버지 파르데나 저도다 파르 가서 뭐니 버는 신세네 장면의 셰비네야 전체부 봐 아니 생활의 셰비네야 다 니지 전부 이종을 되네 심진 참 심진 다 간다지 심진기 가서다 지시 심진기 주고 마세게 봐도 다 되세도 니지 심빈 주고 미세바 인두사네 다디 장신 균인 줘봐라야 베투 매도 좀 뉴투 매도 좀 내세 장원의 셰베 디질라송 당 가상만 잘해봐 장원의 삼담이나 카나고 아니 데레스 가사 인주
그래서 인주
다대양 인주 다다디 코알랭에 버죠 잠에 봐 시신이랭에 버죠 다들이 공방 상부터 거로 봐 장원의 셰나 들려도 시행원 신탕이
This Buddha nature, this potential for the removal of all temporary stains or obscurations, is present as an essential attribute of the minds, or within the minds of all beings. And in turn, its principal attribute is compassion itself. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, compassion can be said to have two potential focuses. It can be inwardly focused or directed, or outwardly focused or directed. Another way of looking at this is the two aspects of bodhicitta itself, which in that context are called
compassion.
Compassion.
Himself.
Compassion can be said to have two aspects: compassion itself, focused on beings, and compassion that is essentially inward directed, focused on the achievement of supreme awakening. The achievement, the object of the internally focused compassion is the achievement of a perfect awakening that actually transcends both samsara and one-sided nirvana. And the object or purpose of outwardly focused compassion is the actual performance or engagement in benefit for others. In that these two are equally aspects of compassion, we can think of compassion as being similar to a two-sided mirror, a mirror that has two sides that are equally reflective and that are really two aspects of the same mirror, the same thing. Outwardly focused compassion expresses or displays itself upon awakening as continuous activity for the benefit of beings that will continue as long as beings continue to exist, which is a truly excellent aspect or quality of mind. The inwardly focused compassion, which yesterday I said is what we would normally call renunciation, here is renunciation that is distinguished by the fact that it is not only the renunciation of samsara, but also the renunciation of one-sided nirvana.
딱이네 니지 사변디 배 가서래 드레지스야 좋아서 가서 이제 가서다 봐 세르 막 버는지 싸워네 저 세르티 다봉예리 하고 가서 싸던도 제마신다는 데네요 봐 가서다 세네 다지 세장 좀만더 이제 가서고 대가자 쓰지에 다로 뭐네 근데 직 최고 난신 아니 니지 사변 예비네 다 대양고 가서에 배장 가르쳐마 장네 아니 세팅 님보 수련고 다는 당아도 로장고 그랬다 니지 로장하디 다 계속 시작하니
Now, because this seed of compassion is ubiquitous, because it is possessed by all beings, we can say that all beings, including animals and so forth, possess it. Which means that the mere presence of the seed of compassion itself is not sufficient. For example, it is like gold ore found in the ground. Just as in order to acquire gold, one needs to find and then refine the gold ore in order to produce gold, in the same way, we need to discover and refine the seed of compassion within us, which we do by training our minds.
Mind training, some of that lojong nyamne a주 페리아 and that's 가수에 베르 조가담 받남지 로종 기념내 시라 제도 된 남버스 다디 로종사도 로장한테 가르스나 조 전주스em 로셰바디 전주스em체 대장와에 미치는 다 로종스 다 대야 전주스em 그 자와데 대자와 닝지다 저왕제보 다된 초대 도비 가사 닝지데 니라메데 이시수사 점래 드레 뉴산다 다 대자와 대한 조베 닝지를 잘해 되어 인두산에 아니 다 닝지로 장과데 개점이 있어요 텔레야다 로장도 망부요래 베는 근데 명아 dwing게고네 로장바다 다시냠 제고는 로장으로 쏘다 망부요래디 다 가르지네 다 나신 부신의 저 방시에선 들면로 나신 부신 그냥 신규비
나신 부신 세나
나신 부신 심무증 뭐 할래 할래 뭐저서
나네 맞다 맞어
나신 부신 스두산 디네 도시엔 디네 도시엔 안데 벽에 베킨자 교회죠
The practice of Mahayana mind training has been especially emphasized by the Kadampa tradition of Lord Atisha. And the term mind training here has a particular or special meaning. Mind here refers specifically to bodhicitta, and the training of the mind means the cultivation of that bodhicitta. The roots of bodhicitta are the process of development, includes the development of compassion and that non-dual wisdom, which aligned with compassion is the cause of awakening. But of these, what must be principally cultivated is compassion, which is the root of bodhicitta itself. Therefore, many methods are taught for the cultivation of this, principally the exchanging of oneself for others and many other methods, sometimes taught in a series of 7 gradual stages and so on. I'm going to present this in a, I don't know how to say this in English. It's like picking bits and pieces from, it doesn't mean random, it doesn't mean haphazard, but it means kind of picking out what's useful from all over the place. Eclectic, yeah, that's good. Selective, I like selective and eclectic. Selectively eclectic.
Discuss. Selective the jamaradi.
Mare selective sene damka soya. Eclectic de yamore. Eclectic nazin pusin da wore.
Picking pieces. Picking pieces. Oh no. 제가 더 토마디 베네 니지 가나기에 니지 가나기에 유저로 그게 다들 개좀 물어봐다. 다들 왜 쓰는 거야? 대 미망을 대 강의를 직접 알아. 그래서 참참 ngazögi benda bechachu ngazögi te semle tele ha shubu garbonuchi yobche ta ka kasu da digalya ta benim ninji gida ninji kanami ka ninji kesar bakarina ta digal be shuga diga zhigu ming zhigu yana ta kharji tene zhigu shuga be gari erjumuchi ba yana ming zhigu da ta tele 참참 다 대단 아주 쇼가버지마다 지당 닌지 깨고 삼바라 튠지 점 쇼부가보 노지마 다디가 오늘 나바세요 마다 수다 닌드가스 닌지지 가르소에 술래야 마미비 닌지를 지다 닌지 카얌 점섬마다 카얌 점 텐데 마도 매외서 다그 닌지 스르자 참참 티쇼부 가버디가라 베나 소소기 밤에 민기 참참 펜슬 키티 되네 참좀 기본 맞춰 봤어 근데 용도도 와 대답들 망고 용도 와 근데 그래서다 개 지슈를 가지고 뒤가려 오늘 미유기 샘진 다베너지 타통만 고주서다 랑게 배지 배 친차와다 랑래 제외 가사대 존에 고조제 다 간다 갈라 간저지 가죠 미유디즈 베지 세버지 과디 개점면서 안다가 니지도 지가죠 미유세라 메세라 비지 또네 아니지 니제 사르지 니지 가면 차비네 니지 쇼스게 하나 지초진이 데레샤다 초진이 참성하죠 니지디 베나 컴퍼니 나로리아 미망고 여러봐 네가는 컴퍼니 미망고 예주사네 아주 땅에 야게지 바자르 신기베
시기도 가서 빼지 던 것도
바자르 기 힌디 네 바자르 힌디마도 싱가와 말
라서
다 근데 이제 다 간다 이 바자르 나네 아주 제 첨보 중요네 에디 미사메 그거가는 파 가서 급샤나 내려봐 여러 제 첨보 급샤나 다 이내 제 첨보 때문에 자네 뚝네 미린 거라 샤모를 서거나 데스칼에 여러 다 세자오로 참서 에네들 르잠바다 마림바 나소 용거로 와 걔네들 아주 대단히 이제 지다가 지 가서지 아직 탐제 예 삼사를 디나바 가서지 매바 좀 세샤로 오늘 전에 가사 디 인들이야 아니 지게게 인스면 조조인데 아니 이제 다다지 가서 아 다들지 니지게 안 강에도 와
메모벌 참나
말하면
메뉴 메레레라
지당 다 컴바디나 미상은 인지 검선디스 레라버 저 가나서 다 간다 미리스 주주요 아마도 다디 상마 기부 용화쇼 동해 마용쇼서 레라버도 이네 교란라 기부 용화쇼 동해 마용쇼 검사나 지제 교란라 시다지 교란라 뒤균디 미디 가사디 교란라 가보시라 매밤 야나 교란라 내가 좀 아디 로 이동호에 그 삼바면나
나서
근데 교란라 되니 동해 용 마용쇼 ene dewa yong sho samro ning tabane ja kala gabodo wa
나서
ji jana do dewa yong sho 동에 ti zi yo 근데 용스로 봤다 근데 인도산다 딩 아주 되다 니지디 튠지다 보면 지가 지 먹음도 보면 무슨 단니지게 배 짱장요데 근데서 가라가
나서
미유 가서 심제를 해와라 미 니지 잘잖아 이제 가라가요디 맨저 송도다 베나디 근데 인자들 다다 니엔디 배 가가치고 좀 전대로 봐
나서
소소 다 인도산에 당원에 전다 뒤균 가서 심진 탐지스를 내라봐도 봐 Yena simje thamje nane khebar ji chene di kyorang ga da di nye de da la gom sidi oh this gala kha simje thamje sidi le la bya da nye gi yaw ma che be chen ji simje thamje sidi oda simje na de war ju ji ka tras ka so ji le labor ji ba ji ka so sometimes and le la so ta yimi ne da da nye ru chen ne ana da le 니지 검사로 나는 가시 양배 니 배나 파마는 니지 검사를 깔아가도 가시
The first step in the cultivation of compassion is to determine an initial object or focus for whom or toward whom you will develop compassion. This is very important, although this also is a step that can be problematic sometimes for some people for reasons that will become evident. The reason why we need a focus, a specified focus for our compassion, is that, to give you a traditional analogy, our minds are a little bit like a piece of paper, a piece of white paper with nothing written on it. And if you try to just generate compassion without a specific focus, may I feel compassion for all beings and so on, then it can lead to the compassion being no more than an abstraction, being very vague and indistinct and not very powerful or heartfelt. On the other hand, if you focus on a person or persons, which in the analogy is like drawing a portrait of someone or perhaps writing their name on the piece of paper, then the focus for the compassion becomes precise. Because it is personal, it becomes heartfelt rather than remaining a vague abstraction. As for on whom one should focus, sometimes you can change the focus. For example, to continue with the analogy, you may want to initially develop compassion focused on both or one of your parents. You would write, in that case, in the analogy, their name or names on the paper, but with pencil. So that if at some point, for whatever reason, you found one or both of your parents difficult objects to feel compassion for initially, you could erase their name, it having been written in pencil, and then write someone else's name instead.
Okay.
Then, however, in general, one should begin by cultivating compassion for whoever has been kindest to you, for whomever it is easiest for you to feel compassion. But in general, we need to start the development of compassion with some precise object. Otherwise, it will be too vague. However, on the other hand, there is also a sense in which to make it not too specifically focused can be helpful as well. For example, to use a different analogy, there are a lot of people in this room. If I were to go into the marketplace and buy a huge piece of cloth or tarpaulin, I could easily drape it over everyone if the cloth were big enough all at once without having to cut the cloth or make any specific measurements. If, on the other hand, I wanted to make a hat or head covering for each and every person, that would involve a lot of cutting, a lot of measuring, a lot of counting, and so on. In short, a lot of work. In the same way, if one attempts to focus one's object of compassion on one person, because one may have a limited amount of benevolence toward that person, either through lack of familiarity or through excessive familiarity or through simply not having that good a feeling about the person, one's compassion may be somewhat mixed. For example, and His Holiness used me as an example for this, which is apt in so many ways, so you might think, instead of, it's easy to think about everyone in this room, may they all be happy, may they never suffer. But if you focus on one person, for example me, you might think, well, I want him to be happy, but I'd also like to see him suffer a little bit. I think it might do him some good. And which would place a little bit of a limit on the intensity or purity of the compassion. In which case, it's difficult to develop the compassion using that type of focus. And if one tries to force oneself to do so, in spite of the specific focus, it will still remain just an abstraction, the idea of compassion, rather than the actuality of it. So in this case, sometimes it's good not to make too fine separations. For example, sometimes in the development of compassion, we separate beings into friends and enemies. And then we initially try to develop compassion for friends, but then when we try to develop for enemies, we have a very hard time. So sometimes it's best not to make such distinctions and develop compassion. Yeah. I said, but you said that. And he said, I did say that, but you didn't understand it.
Distinction mena yagares.
The tata jada nyenwa distinctions on then some drawola
Madam, distinction so much okizamada.
Lasa. I don't like your shasora.
Okay. Taban did the shen juta. Younger shena, yes, some letter, Tambo, Jizawe, Jiniji, Udopina, Majutambo, Jizawe, Marshall, Zawe Master, Cetaric, Marshall. Aju Jidanga, Manche, Zawashurti, Munetine, Kasre. Azor Sona Chishurti, Pamaniti, Nanaja Amacha de Orba, Sona Shujiade. Drindu, did Zawe, Madi. Miniji mi disability that tell up needs hair of Johnson that till ringed of the gupche and Tamje Lolia Jikashraji, Ringden, Rochaji. They catch me that. Penaji Subject Chicket Holia, Niji, Caronet, and set Toji. They are what of Jikashraji, Niji, Budawaji, I was get to Bimbina. Oh, Tana is indeed ringed and some Jindala, Jikashre. That ring Java Sedustana. Simgentia, Anna Junze, Teta Choji, Legit Tone, and a bit, Cartridge, Snatamjele, Slash, Tito Yang, Go Shini, Gone Bear, Carsue, Diane, Teleniji, Carsweta, Jumzen Samotango, Stabebche, Tangi Zavegi, Niji Utilia, Jumzen Samotambe, Lord John, the Chavel, Denetigi, and that Jumzen Church, what is not the Tonchi uncle. Gone be go to go, maybe jet, Caligari, Leon of Chin Dry, which is in those ups. Then do some take edge of those. Madobe, as which is simply tradition to send that Zuzuni. Carsureta, de la Ninji days ago, Ninji days ago. Did it Chabinetta, Paji, Tarj Mebre, Tarkaske, Omardaina, Zudi. Tambo Zawe, Niji Miru Chiavian, Titolabe, Niji Lobe, or set over the Butamology. Chavina, I wish I orders. Tagging is out of Carasana, Mika said the Gange orders. Bena Jala Ninji Gomituba. Young Kashik and the disco. Jala Ninji Gomtuandos, in a Abba Mana Ninjitana Gomtu Gomindosta. That could be Abba Mana Justin Buser. No, that's how. Chung Gala Bay, no, that's how says. Caran di Chiagore, di Chiago Mares, and Cozube around to misery. Cruel. Betongo user. And coming do that. In that, about Savage, Sim Gilia, Chorangi, when it Niji. Get lava, the Niji Sim Gilia, Niji set over to the beautiful cabin, and Tine, the Junzendi. Subjection di Junze Rixi Waton, legally or Niji. They love to get orders. Today, my imagine that Savage Niji, me but there's some kind of a chen. And there's Kasure, the Niji Chatala, Matala, the Kasure, the Hasaji, the doors, Hasaji, the Yunga and so on.
The starting point or root of the development of compassion is to pick the one person for whom you find it easiest to develop compassion. Traditionally, and for many of us, this would be our mother in this life, because simply for most of us, the person to whom we feel the most gratitude is, in general, our parents, and especially our mother. And because we feel the greatest amount of gratitude toward her, it is easiest for us to develop love and compassion toward her initially. The way that you do this is you first cultivate compassion directed at that specific person or object until it acquires authenticity, until it becomes authentic, heartfelt compassion. Then you gradually expand that compassion beyond that limited object so that it includes more and more beings. This expansion, however, does not involve separately working out the whole logic behind compassion, such as the relationship between gratitude, love, and compassion for each person. It having been worked out in relation to the initial object, typically one's mother or whomever, one then simply extrapolates the compassion itself and expands it to embrace other beings, gradually, eventually all beings, by means of the recognition that all beings are fundamentally similar to one's mother or whomever the person is on whom it was initially focused. It has to be done this way because if you attempt to separately go through the whole process or of the logical process of the development of compassion for each person, again separately, then the process becomes endless. So one first or initially develops authentic compassion for a one person and then expands it to include all beings. Now what I was saying before was that some people have trouble with certain, especially traditional objects of the initial focus of compassion. Some people have trouble feeling compassion for their enemies. Other people have an easier time feeling compassion for enemies than they do for their parents. They may regard their parents as having been in some way abusive or cruel, or at least having been too strict or restrictive. And because they harbor some woundedness or resentment toward this, the parents are for them not a suitable object with whom to begin the process of compassion. In that case, one should simply pick the person, whomever it may be, for whom it is easiest for you to initially feel compassion. And then, having gained authenticity in compassion with regard to that person, then expand it as before.
베나 치 구유 베나 민파면데 가서다 지신 디게 니지게 좀에서 그러봐 데니지게 볼 때는 하고 니지냐면 공부를 펜도 연구도 쓰는 하나데 초화를 줘 가라잖아 베나 치 지신 답변은 진주신이 버디서 에는 가소리야 펜도 가르쳐 봐 아직 가소리다 거진 시험 컨테 봐 티 니주이데다 가서 밀레 삼망보다 뒤서 삼산에 밀레야지 삼도 뒤서네 파거진 좀 삼나야 수 미생데 괜찮아요다 수지 파거진 좀 인삼 텐데네 수양 그 남중에 바라봐야지 그지 되는데 sem 로판버드니 용거로 다이네 지신아 제대로 그뒤에 거진 체체르지마도 다 구좀 미선 남중에 버게 바장에 버좀 아소게 샤메 인자 디지 삼담비는 지체 레라버스면도 송도 드레이드산에 에네 베른 준신의 때네 베른 아주변 옥시준사 안다나 지집에 사제라 소바 망보지 사베세 안 로베 탭다 아니全배 그라 소바 망보지 총보인바 진짜가 거진 치주 네 삼다 거 아들 진주신이다 남제 망보진 저번에 도리야 단 준신 상으로지 신나서 안에 지자매 자동도抓다 안 주시면 뭐 제도 제가 진짜가 다시 니주 가서 냠가에 나로요 봐. 니주 냠가와 근데 지금 딱 고준 주신이 근데 주신은 딱 가서 초 연하면한테 간다 다 고랑 라이프 sommer 단동이네 모두는 라이프 진도요 진도요 자꾸 게임 거라 베나디 저리 양사고 아니 진짜라고 주신 게임도 고랑 진도요자 아니 양사로라야 고 게임도 삼성 컴퓨터에 가는 게임도 제가 고랑 진도를 제비임자 제가 안디 제가 다 간다가 주디 respect 답변 드리자는 green compassion. compassion 정구지.
맞어.
전에 보면 좋아서 다 간다 집시 다 간다. 배 가르쳐야지. 미점도 마세베. 미점도 인지게 와면 뭐 소소 돈들어서 봐라 인지게 줘도. 자외게 인지게 유대 가르쳐는 데도 아니 치유 용어도 사는 데도 가르쳐는 데도 나 사는 데도 가르쳐는 ninja sampai ngadar juga ninja ko rawa sida mendo freedom sida mendo pressure mangbodo ninja
One need not select a particular human being, however, as one's initial focus. It could be a different kind of being, even something in the environment, like, for example, a tree or trees. I think that plants
and trees.
Plants and trees. I think I think and feel that it is appropriate to select plants and or trees, appropriate and beneficial in several ways, to select these as initial focuses of compassion. One would go through the same process, beginning by reflecting upon the kindness of these to us, reflecting upon how much good, how much they do us, how much our survival and well-being depends upon them, and so on. One of the advantages of doing this is that if one focuses on a specific person and attempts to wholeheartedly cultivate an attitude of gratitude for that person, one may subsequently become affected by their particular display or reaction to the changes in one's attitude. One doesn't face this obstacle with a tree. As for the things to reflect upon with trees and plants, they create the oxygen which we need to live, as well as being sources of our clothing, our food, our paper, and so on. As well, reflect upon the awful plight which they face, being cut down, being carved up, being processed, being turned into whatever they're turned into, and so on. Now, I don't know whether trees and plants are literally conscious or not, but they certainly are life in some sense. They are alive, and they wouldn't grow if they didn't have the desire to do so, to grow and survive.
They want to live.
If they wouldn't grow if they didn't want to be alive, want to live.
No. They want to continue to
yes, if
live.
They didn't want to continue to live.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. They wouldn't grow if they didn't want to continue to live. For example, they will grow even in relatively inhospitable environments, such as on the edges or faces of cliffs, and occasionally even on rooftops. So this type of compassion focused upon living things in the environment, is what we could call green compassion, and is particularly valuable and appropriate nowadays. In general, my point is that one's initial object or subsequent objects of compassion need not be limited to human beings alone. One's root object can be other types of beings, including animals, including trees and plants, or even me. By me, I mean, he means himself. I'm not being picked on at the moment. But you could think about me with compassion, think about, oh, he suffers so much, he has so little control over where he goes and what he does, freedom, and he's under so much pressure. You said it, not me.
Okay. No. 다들 다들 미지 미유로 이제 가지고 다대야 배나 가지고 심지어 탐지 많이 버셔버려야 아니 저쪽에 개왕어지리야 이제 개과지 용디가래 다들 이제 개도 붙을 된저기 니주 남샤 개왕어지 남샤 셰버체 거대 개심시라리샤 이나야 베나다 기부름 딩타순 숨바나시다 기부름 기부타마 다 기부타마들이야 에너지 조다 배번이 요청면다 배바디 주인비나 바지 센디마도베 에지 치면 디드 퇴니시라메데 아 디주시에도 인비냐 거 남지르다 지용디요 드네 주사네 바지 센디베 다다 파마 마제베 내가나 아니 거진 차와이 바다 디주 지삼담비네야 보면도 송도 가르시나 아주 tinsan zambulin디 참으로 핀주 뭐 closer som다 참으로 녀보여야 될 지당 zam불이 춘춘 차디야래 핀주 지기질이야对아기 배 가수에对습 첨부시다 차디요 드레지가 나로래 아니 아주 사매기 에네 가수는 다 코너 서만 저분이 코너 지리 유에데 니주디 엔 클릭거진 저분이 차장기 니주 차도 다 간다 저분이 가서 차세 지리 유에데디 affect or 서만 다 들리지 on the 윈주산 디 준zel 때네 간다 아주 저분이 버딜이야 낭 핀순이야 가서 펜을 잡아 상명이 돼봐 근데 디 잡아들 빠지 렌제스 라는 좀 렌제 잡아 아주 기부지기질이야 근데 차와진 티 상행이 차와체인도 상행이 펜을 가서 리본 진대야디 내가 다 렌제데 슉 전부 여대 지당 나들이나 지금 미tunshone sometimes already 이번에 저디 아주 다르지 튠shone 상사 positive 디토네 지 가서에 지 삼다체 삼으로 지 그린 차와인 바당 삼으로 개차와인 바당 안 게시 네거티브 도나 삼다비네야 다 저디 심진신 대보 뭐중나 아니 심진신 지 뇽몽베 원주 제 아니 심진신다 디디지 디기 뭐중나 장리네 디긴 중앙 가라 가봐봐 디데 니주 삼다나 버지 디그로 가다 디디 디준센 데네 근데 데 니주 삼다 파마 마제베 내가블라야 다 나고다냐 심지 탐정이나 삼다마도는 점불림바 디기 에네 좋아 탐제베 가슈 내당 같이 샤데요 데 삼다비네야 근데 이제 생각지 삼다고 하게 아니지 제 다달래야 지 심지 탐제게 다다 랑라 파마 니마도 요마데 파다 니섬 파지 마지마도 요마데 심지 탐제가 랑가 파마 제요 마다 다 됐네 그것도 이내야 파마 마제베 니거나야 그린처와 인비 삼다지 용리
Traditionally, it's taught that once we have cultivated compassion for the initial focus, the initially chosen object of our compassion, we then extrapolate it to gradually toward all beings, based upon the understanding that throughout beginningless samsara, all beings have time and time again, each and every being has time and time again been our mother. Now, obviously, the acceptance of this depends upon the belief in past and future lives, in rebirth, which in turn depends upon usually depends upon the study and understanding of the logical proofs establishing rebirth. Nevertheless, just as a distinction is made in ways of pursuing the path based upon gradations of individual practitioners, initially it is possible to begin by focusing only on one's connection with others in this life, which manner of focus obviates the necessity of believing in past and future lives. There are advantages to this. There are other advantages to this as well. For one thing, this life and this world is an object of immediate experience to us. It is therefore relatively easy for us to feel strongly about others in this world. The way in which we extrapolate compassion toward others, considering this life alone, is by reflecting upon the fact that pretty much every significant event that occurs in any locality on this world will eventually affect everyone in the whole world. And we can regard this type of interdependent connection among the beings on this planet as a type of karmic connection. Now, one can reflect upon this in a negative way, but perhaps it would be best to approach it in a positive way by reflecting upon how the benevolence of other beings brings about or enables your welfare. You could, however, even think about it negatively. For example, the fact that the suffering or misery of other beings becomes a direct or indirect cause of your misery as well. In short, even though you do not for the moment consider past and future lives and all beings having been your mother and so on, even though you are limited to the consideration of one set of parents in this life, you can still extrapolate this compassion toward all beings based on the connectedness of all beings in this world.
Oh, yeah. Today, Karsurusana, and that 10 Zutelian, that's all. Tadanga, Karsurji, Najer, Shuche, that Naji, Karsur, that come get Janatama, Jin, some 20 or that. That 20 not all day. Not inside it, some shan then a bit short devji, the chung devji. Today the Kora, the Shibuji in somebody, and it's some shan dene, and I get chat, the Joran, I get chat chumbade, some shan dene, chumbara. Today do sane, take you and dene, and that's all that cutting the channel, that tin some mango dinner. That's all existing. It's what they were there, and it is some shade in the I don't know the thing again, JJ. She has Random, I yet and dry every day, just some jensen down, then choiba. That the name is antiques and then Quinky Zawade, and some jensen, Nyawara level in Dusana, then I'll do just some town when they came to be started. That getting jealous and so we need to Karimba. We will Jungian Karimba. Think I should share it, more travel chat at the door. Some of the uncle getting jealous doing Jimmy Kashua and Beji Kashua. And the assembly are getting to this. I say something like getting tension go to Susan. The God just someone swore Kansado Kashi Mika, getting tension go as it ane ji madhya tang gadin che che chawar si samla pressure new shoot tabar tongdo da dinja mai so so ngoyo ge ne jun jung gen khare ba ran da chowa da kharala dene chodo ji simje shala dene chowa de yim ha ko na da ba ji ka choya ko chowa lendo khabar de de ha ko da kech mi sha
I say this because sometimes when people are taught to cultivate gratitude for others, they start to feel strange, as though they're being pressured to believe to cultivate a gratitude that they do not naturally feel. This feeling of pressure is unnecessary, and we can avoid it by simply attending to the actual facts, the actual circumstances, the real reasons why we are in fact dependent upon on the kindness of others. And if you consider them, then a natural feeling of appreciation and gratitude will arise.
다 맛이 지금 텐팀 거진 제시를 늦어বে 도네 맛이 제시 다 근데 저 거진 게 당연히 이제 소만 거진 게 당연히 시도사네 안에 장래야지 팬도의 정신 장래 제의 정신 근데 인버데我吹的山人心给得了呀移动啊的界限旁边落西我不是可里可里钱用啊之类的啊这里就是啥呢但那个男性的界限旁边落西的界限比旁吧是就是啥呢他这天基本上是加了说随便的本来不穷穷的这里啊这个穷穷的感觉吧你们看是啥톰 중중을
제제
다 된다고 가다지 삼리아 가지고 그게 가사데 이동을 지당 에너지 제신 팡바 안데 라버는 문제봐 에너지 가서 에디 재활은 문제봐 다 된지 가서지 제신 팡바 로시 다 중에 상례 아니고 참바사야고人性다 용디가 아니 참바고 야게 루드스탄에 내가 리그르지 니지 나물이야 주야로 다 도시메레 근데 루스탄 도나 니지사디 아니 장왕거고 소소 당와야 봐다 장왕 때문에 그러고 클리컬이 깨스니 야게 다를 마도베 아니 고 소소기 될래야 탄되당 아니 가르쳐지 당과 가면 니지 거랑 주야지 매로와 다들 니지사데 니지 거랑 유 지당 니지 디나는 개와사디 계획이 배우선한테 개와디 무슨이야 장화지 저도 소소리야 당과지 저도 뒤지 제일 초다 미죠 개와래야 개와 제다 미제사 당과를 찍스도 미기와 레연도사는 용어도 레연도사는 아니 뭐냐면 게 미제선 당과시다 매데 저고 아주 남산지 레연예서 들지도 와 녀모바디 녀모바디 가정을 교류인도사네 장이 당과시다 매데 당과 choice 이거 가르친 바지다지 엄마네 지 녀모라 로 컴배 왕기 우리 정신기 아니 당과 맞제 전용 매배 권내네 지게용이 계획선 대전에 초지네 초진의 장로 장왕 저기에 같이 그러나 계획선 게 미게 더 고급지다 장왕 예배지 돈에 안 당화차 예배 인도산 디준선 되네 아니 야 아주디 장왕 도삼네 아 참자 장왕 도삼이 주산한디 지 가르다 다제난 저도 마제난 저도 소소로 차이로 삼서 장화를 주주산 다지 개와디 제난 저도 마제난 저도 the Numodi, but I shed out of the Magina, Dixamaras or something. I did it, no Jews. Zawan, you made a hammer or chain, and it shouldn't Tidechiki, Kashre, long over the channel. That they need to Tikus and Tene. That Gawada Ninji Rani Rang Samuel, the Zawan Topercheva. Church dollar never check where they catch them.
When we reflect upon the kindness of another person to us, how much they have helped us, how much good they have done us, how loving they are to us, we will naturally and gradually start to feel love for them. We will come to cherish them and treasure them. It'll be a little bit like the attitude of a small child toward her stuffed animals, of which she may be so fond. A small child will feel great attachment toward their stuffed animals, such that they intensely wish that the animal or animals not be lost, not be destroyed or damaged in any way, and so on. So in that way, one will develop an attitude of treasuring the person whose kindness one appreciates, and this will cause love to arise naturally, and then in the wake of love, compassion. Compassion arises and develops based on our free choice, our free and conscious choice that it developed. Compassion is not developed by accident. It is not developed in a state of no freedom to choose. In general, virtue arises based on a conscious choice. This is somewhat different from the way kleshas arise within our minds. Kleshas typically arise without much choice on our parts as a result of our previous habituation to them. On the other hand, virtuous thoughts, to be fully authentic, must arise as a result of our free choice to give rise to them. So in this context, remember that you have the freedom to make this choice, to cultivate compassion and to cultivate a virtue. I say this because sometimes people become hopeless. They think it doesn't matter whether I make any effort to cultivate virtuous thoughts or not, because I have no power, no ability to stop kleshas from arising. This is incorrect. It's important that we actually consciously choose to cultivate freedom and control of our own mind.
단도나 니지 로르지게 단도 니지 세두사네 동해 천도에 나버지 다들이 주산 다대야 니지 나버대야 베나 아주 도대게가 잠버자에 원도스 동해 기뉴 미베티 저게 남도 꾸두슈스 드리지 가서 니지 나버 둔셰 니지 민남 둔 nin tabe nin jiru nin jizu ji gorbata samdang gorwa naso gyumzin kangi nin jewa samdang understand jambar jai wandu so dumye kinu mbeti naso dampote rabdo barwe jai wandu sons rabdo barwe jai wandu sons dusan takanda be kasreji menashin rejigo be kasre shindu nebe sik버는죠 신도네 안에 가서다 다대야 sik버대야 안에 다다디 가서래 채직마이마 안에 채직 가서지 고안에 가서 겨안에 제외 봐도 sik버는죠 다들 이제 자유왕도 송 다대야지 머리바다 안에 셔든 가서 되샤셔달라 소리 rab도 바에 자유왕도 주바다 동해 기는 민배 집스 데이디노 데이다 가서 rabdum bawe daya wangdo churne nyomobe wangdo churne ene lesa bara dene en dibu dunghe naso nyong dunghe kine mumbe tips tandung ine dunghe ki nöndebe ine tandung ine anji karjwe ji saje ki dewa chamo zamle ane dewar shene da dine ji 뇽모 제 머리비미 뭐 토부지니야 봐 아니 저게람도 군도 쇼스 아드네 진짜 다 사제기 대화를 응원신 예배 인도사 다 단동이네 지 사제기 대화 변하지 가서에 변하지 덴드르기 덴로도 다 드네기 사제기 대화 내급기 대화 참모성량 원버신 다 들리지 돌아가는 되버지 이나 다 덴로디 더도 동해매베 대화 탐바민베 인도사 엔 덴드르기 가서 롱제베 개와 투세 인도사 양마 라량에 손을 맞지니 간다 다 진짜게 간다 군제 망부지게 도하는 가서 지인지 민남 장네 ene samda yechi minam chu ta ma song ya dina ta de da di chue ba da kan minam junzi mangbe tuan junzi kan gi ning jia ning ji lu ge nei ma ti ta junzi mangbe tuan sam ta ye ba ta de bres
in the compassion is essentially the desire for the freedom from suffering, the desire when focused on others that other beings be free from suffering. The reasons for compassion are explained in the Sutra Alankara as principally 10. Many reasons why it is appropriate to feel compassion for beings. These include, for example, in the words of the text, that beings are under the power of a fiery or blazing enemy. And this blazing enemy refers to the ignorance and kleshas of beings, which cause them to, without any control or freedom, undertake continuous rebirth in samsara. Secondly, beings are obscured by the darkness of their suffering. This means that as a result of these kleshas and ignorance which cause rebirth, beings accumulate karma, and this accumulation of karma in turn causes beings to actually suffer. And that way, beings are oppressed and menaced by their great suffering. And then third, in the midst of all this suffering, when beings experience a brief moment of relief, such as rebirth in a higher state and so on, they cling to the defiled and unstable happiness that they briefly experienced there, as though it were going to be lasting and were stable. And this clinging itself causes the accumulation of further actions which lead to further rebirth and so on. So in short, for these and many other reasons, it's explained in the Sutra Alankara, the ornament to the sutras, how why it's appropriate to feel compassion and how one can develop it.
다 전화 도로데 에너지 가르쳐서나 니지데 나바세네나 니지데 코바나 베샤요 말했다. 다데 니지 베라데 shrine room 나로레 데네 베 니지게 심제다우지 니지게 이내양 치료 레갈레 and going to walk 말했어. office dinner ledu tene ninji sama pa pang tene be tene 가져야지 가져다 야베 농사보다 콜사보다 이제 어디 저스게면도 어디 니지 쉬는 룸에 샤셔 데 니지 사야 니지 데베 쉬어발이야 라렌 따로 오거스 아주 되게 냠렌스거로 냠솔렘바 세주사네 냠솔렘바 다 소소레 집에나지 니지 냠맘 니지 가수레다베 초와 충분히 라도 렘바 라렌도 따라와 아 니지 고거를 니지 충분히나 아니 신내지 니지 사야데 고 가수레다 닌지 칠레서나도 닌지 르바서나도 액션을 듣고 신이치기 얼마도 같이 닌지 삼바 코나 여버데 야다 야버래지 이미데 닌지 다 칠레서나도 그런 거 레가르 제거해비나 아니 지가 룽아 토래야 배 개고가 그래서 되네 마쇼이나 깔아 가버시다.
Furthermore, it's taught that we must not keep the compassion we develop hidden within us. This means, for example, one might consciously cultivate compassion for beings while in the shrine room or temple. But then leaving the shrine room, when one goes to work or goes to the office, one might abandon all compassion and return to a habitual state of angry grumpiness. This is not enough. We need to implement or express the compassion we develop in compassionate action. We need to act compassionately. We need to take the feelings of compassion to which we give rise through our practice and bring them into and express them as action or activity. The feelings themselves, of course, are very good, but they must be expressed in action as well.
His Holiness has graciously agreed to respond to some questions. Okay, we'll start with the lady here because it's while she waits for the mic. We'll stand up and speak really loudly so everyone can hear your question. Well, for those who didn't hear the question, the relationship. Sorry. Please repeat that.
Yeah. You were saying that you were saying about the subtle mind and subtle prana. How is it related to the interconnectedness? And the second question is that
you can't hear. Your mic is not.
I can repeat the question because I'm hearing it. So I can repeat it and then everybody will hear it. So you don't need to go it again. So first part is the relationship between the subtle prana mind and interdependence. And the second part is?
And the interconnectedness of
yes.
things. And the second is that why are on this earth and for how long?
Yeah. By we, you mean the human species or all beings?
All beings.
Okay. So the question is, yesterday Your Holiness spoke about the subtle prana mind, and could you explain the relationship between that and interconnectedness? And secondly, why are we on this earth and how long will we be here?
Ninji sem chama somar sem chama da kada siri ki tibi nimburu chi karshurada
Konga do dere.
Du sem chama dero de long dero
Lare long sem chama.
Long du sana kabdelia long sa de ngazo long ki jakayam yowe cha
Laso.
yowe cha che long so
Laso.
Pena shiba di yuren jukbe cha jo
Laso.
shiba di yuren yowe cha jo da de la long ba da sha re
Laso.
da ko lungi tunda de karasana yoam kanda ko karshura di ujo jabru chirba
Laso.
shiba di yoam yuren jukbe cha ne long sta ani shiba korana shi seri be cha ne seri ge be karshura ta be niburu di da seri zama yin da kada seri be ngone niburu jor ba ta
Laso.
di tunang ma le be seri korana rangsen ba seri de sem ge ngo sa jeri ba
Oh, laso. Sari. Oh, laso.
salary
Laso.
salary sari de karshura korana sari ngone korana
Laso.
di ta de du sana ha go so
Laso.
shiba sa de ta tang de ngo chi wa de sla so
Laso.
가르 시바사디 ene serik chaje ki yula njuwa yula yowe chana lungs ta jara ma lungs ta de sudu yo ma des
나서
tere nusa kun dang ngo ji bor cha chele chane doba di yung yowe doje chane
나서
lungs ta ja yin ene serik kurang ko 가르 serik rengxin ro kurang ene ka khajo da shiba serik kurang de sha chum cha 왜세베자
나서 되네 대당 텐더 게저 나와 가래 거래 공개 잡아 대 롱심신도 잡아 대당 텐더라 잡아 가래 거
텐데스다 드네다 가줄 스템신도 잡아 왜세 다지 벌써 말다 왜세베지고 다 텐데 왜세베지고 대 yu kashrwe yu la yowe cha yu la yo yun ju sang ane ko kashrwe ji ta kada konde chwe tam ji yose le chung so bo yose la ma tim so chunga de yowe chele la dene ya kashrwe ya chung timya de ma yowe chele dene ma ji lu sun ma ting jine ju sang ne ta kanda ji kasha gyazu chebe le shulab jungwa na chi one chena gyazu chulab de gyazu chimbyul da kar chasheru chi so cha de yorba chungya gyazu rang le chu timya gyazu rang la tim da de ne sari ya dang gur den jo
tene twani
ne twani ba jena she chu
oh laso Well, first of all, we need to understand that the term prana here, or sometimes wind, does not refer to literal wind. It's used to refer to movement. And in this case, the inseparability of the very subtle mind and very subtle movement, or the inseparability of mind and wind in general, refers to the movement of the mind. That is, for example, the entrance of one's cognition, one's mind, into an object, the interaction with that object, which can be referred to as a movement or motion of the mind. And in that it is a movement or motion, it is considered a wind. So if we make a distinction between the mind in its essential attributes and the wind, this distinction is a distinction between isolates that are not in actuality two different things, but which we can isolate from one another in discussion in terms of discussing the attributes which are possessed by that inseparable unity. So, for example, when we talk about this inseparable unity as a mind or cognition, we're talking about its fundamental attributes being lucid cognitive capacity or lucid awareness. And when we talk about it as wind or movement, we mean its attribute of moving to, or the capacity to move toward an object, to interact with an object, and so forth. So these are isolates, but not two different things. As far as the relationship between this inseparable wind-mind and interdependence, it is through the movement or motion of this wind-mind that all of the things of samsara and nirvana arise. From the ground or basis, which is this luminous awareness, this extremely subtle mind, when there is movement, then all of the phenomena of samsara and nirvana arise. And they arise through movement of this very subtle cognition, and they dissolve back into the ground of that very subtle cognition itself, also through a movement. Just as, for example, the waves on the surface of an ocean arise from that ocean and dissolve back into that ocean and are made up of nothing but the water of that ocean itself. So that's the first question.
데 ngacho zamboling lare de dang ngacho zamboling de la katsu degi
katsu de
lare kadu
mi sama se re kare
mi sama chi dang so senjen zamboling la pa ke
ti ko as go ren zamboling so re
But how long we're going to be here? Do you mean on this planet or in samsara?
Jumbling deal.
Long Ding Jing Jab Goro. Zambulin di. That's a very easy Kashura. The universal Tabayusha, universal Payusha. They are going to
Lasso.
the our galaxy.
Lasso.
Milky Way. Dinalo Dakanda Kashura Tape, this Dakan de Yam Kashadi, Yam Billing, Yanti Mamusheto, Mamuaresta. Yera the Tadabodon Azuji, when it is so Sotuba.
Lasso.
Tabe between games and Kashura Tabe, Baji, Chinang, twin games on Debe, so to be ne, and Zambulin Dimado. And budget about near your money, or near be near, or tired of Jack, and to picture your Marta.
Lasso.
The day in Dusane, I didn't Zamni leg is Sabas to Dusane, when it's in the Takashura, the G. Missegi Tabe Chidungi less on a mixage, let then a true in Bida, and Tanashang Rujikashre. Lay number member of the Kashrachi, number member sang a caribine, coach a shook chambo yimada. That the rich Sungor, need you stand that day, you sent the Azul Kashre. And that's some of the once our Jeshaben, Perangazuti San Nimani Zibe Sumbadreva.
Larry.
That Nimata Netanani, take Tarin Tanani, Kawajanuro. Tarin Jana Kawaja, Tanya Jana Sik, the Dematata, then a dead water. Sugar set and a shudua.
Lasso.
That the day you saw that they wanted to leg a casual sonam, the digital medicine, the day you saw Diane Shipjeni Zucare, Leakar Saval, and the Chorson, and she Misheda. Takazepa to Diana. And she said, "You did Lord Mashiba to take it."
Lasso.
That's had Congress and in 2012. This year,
First of all, let's limit our field of consideration to this galaxy. Because if we start talking about the universe as a whole, it's going to just get mind-boggling. So if we, as far, there are said to be billions and billions of stars in this galaxy, and many of them apparently have or planets. But as far as we know, this is the only planet that can support life as we know it. And if there are others, they're presumably too far away to be of any practical use to us. Now, this planet is referred to as the place of karma. In one sense, it's because the situations on this planet are very karmic in nature. In particular, it's understood that this planet, as a place which can support life, is a product of the collective karma of those beings who take birth here or become involved with this planet. If we think about it, the circumstances of the Earth are amazing. For example, the Earth is the third planet from the Sun, and that alone makes it just considering that alone, it's one of the things that is necessary for it to be a potential support for life. If we were much closer to the Sun, it would be too hot. We'd be burned. And if we were much farther from the Sun, it would be too cold, and we would freeze. And amazingly, this planet stays in the right orbit so that we get the right range of temperatures and so on. All of this is said to be a result of the collective karma of beings of this planet. Now, as for the details, I don't know the exact details of exactly what karma we've accumulated for this to occur. As far as how long we're going to be here, each and every one of us is here until we die. And then we're not here anymore. We're somewhere else. Is that what you mean, or are you talking about 2012?
No. Lesa, give lesa, but they are Molam Sabio Kajur, the Cheto Bimila, or Javayana and the Jumerji Karswe, Zobole Javala, US.
Now, someone might continue to be reborn on this planet, principally by accumulating the necessary virtuous karma and by making the aspiration to be reborn here. One could continue to be reborn here as well.
If I could just take that a little further, the implicit question, I think, was that what is the purpose of human existence, and not just physical existence, but the very notion of consciousness. Does His Holiness believe that consciousness is a byproduct of biochemical processes? And in that sense, and in those terms, what is its goal, its destination?
Oh boy.
Do you mean purpose in the teleological sense?
Well, in the sense that His Holiness interprets it in what he understands this to be, because when we look at his life, when you look at, I think we're looking at the issue of consciousness here. If we look at life evolves into consciousness. So this evolutionary process, does it have a purpose? Does it have a grand design in the absence of a creator God? Since we don't, for this are essentially agnostic.
The Zamboling de la Yapake Senchin and Nidan Dondo La Sopala Shepang Rikpa Yoraba Shepang Rikpa the Zenik Mancha Wanda Zena, then Sherik Jongwa Deang, then evolution gone at then Jungten, Gedratsu la Tender la Tenet, then Sherik Jongwa is. Then you should know about Gomba Derebes. Yana Natsuke. Chedang Sangatsa Sem Savade, Sherik Jongwade, Jongwage Jutsin, Jongwage Ju, Jongwage Danda, Karin.
Dang son of the science, Charocha. Yes, some Chidangi, that was Sem Sad, go. 아장지 시리기더니 뱀신 재미지 어르 수 뱀보다 봐 유슈아 수 데민 뒤제제 아니 씨바 숨 샤샤나 대단 아주 씨바 사야돼 수의 민게 데민 뒤제 민게 시리기더니 이제 숨고로 봐
La. So.
Hakusu?
The Dumbo, the numbers of the Hakus.
Today in Jusane, yes, somebody Jidangi, Siri, the Nibera, Siri bit and the Kashoji, Nan Shibia Tonia, who Taja Shadi, Pajita, Church in the Savro Chadi, Muma and the physical Manguchi and Kashu. Energy, Yamanaji. Some come to the subject chairman, one in the same Sadi, Kadaji Musicatolia, Tataboto Kusuji, Sabro Chadi research. The Jusana and Kusu some Lebe Lagachitan Koshi or in a Tabi Shinju Tartu change. You Jimson Kalatin Leba Gujay and Gorisana. Penazet, the chick chemical summary, chemical chick the chick 10 in Lagacheris, chick the chick take away Jimson Kare. 아니 가르샤디 깔아가보도 가시 근데 뉴스안에 간다 단도이네 안 가셔에 다시 샤요라 네 섬주도 가르사랑 나랑 섬주로디 섬자 지당 가셔고 세리 정신 간다 가셔다 지 가셔지 자외 지금 가셔지 구조장년으로지 내가 진 알아서 가서 Terea Injikera Tabenaji. Remote control. Remote control. Remote control stay out of daddy. Key Kazar. Keyboard.
Keyboard.
Not keyboard, not this one.
Computer
No. Takada color guar which are the same days. The in yes, some same day, Korang Kanashun, and Zuzu Jayamarva, Koyabe, Denjung, a jiggle DNA, Quelacha, or Mother Kochibuya, Lagazaji, but the Inaso. Kadu in a jig Sunju the here would walk. But Tamatava the Bena Lungsim Tamon and Chakazadi, they Sunju share would mother Jinju said on do. Kita Sunju share in Dusana, Kanda, Benzuan, Shundia Jindusana, but it's some sad the Ankora, Giambet Lebe Chele, the Manguchilia, doing Yanko, Chawane, the Yulan Juberche, Kashotaji, Belunga, Chawachalia, what from young, Guyam, what is somebody to woman or something. Today, Dusanga, Guyam, what somebody is in a hako, United Zave, Kashure, Yambe, Chapel, Kashuzawe, Gibe. Good the hammer watch it, and then you zoom away on the Mendoson. Teribeta, to what there was
dying better.
In better,
In better way, maybe Dopayo.
maybe Tawaye,
Maybe Dopayo.
maybe Tawaye and another to what the tin chip here.
Well, when we talk about a mind or consciousness, which has the fundamental attributes of cognitive lucidity, the capacity to know, then we think of it as one of three categories of things: forms and non-mental formations, or non-cognitive formations, and then cognition. And of these three, the consciousness is what can also be called cognition. Now, when science, I should be speaking this way. That's no good. Nobody heard what I said, did they? All right. What you did? Okay. He did. So then, when scientists examine consciousness, because of the procedure of science, they're necessarily doing it based upon the examination of the physical. Such as, for example, the examination of the interaction of brain chemicals or other physical processes in the brain, and the consideration of mind or cognition, consciousness, as a result of some interaction of chemicals, such as in the proposed evolution of consciousness. But the question remains, even if consciousness resulted from the interaction of chemicals, why did those chemicals interact in such a way as to produce consciousness? Furthermore, we think of our mind, our cognition, as the controller of our bodies. But the mind and body exist as an interdependent a union of two things. A union must always be the union of two things. You can never use the term union for just one thing. And in the same way, the interdependence of mind and body would not have arisen through the pre-existence of the body and then or form and the subsequent arising or arrival of cognition. So I think that when we examine the attributes of consciousness through the examination of the interaction of brain chemicals, the interaction of chemical processes in general, we are certainly examining one aspect of it. But I don't think that through such examination, I don't think that we have yet ascertained the fundamental cause for the presence of consciousness.
Yeah, Your Holiness, I have a question about suffering on the level of the Nirmanakaya tulku, which is illusory body. So I want to ask you, is there suffering, and in which way is there suffering, or do you experience, basically what I want to ask is, do you experience suffering on your level, which I perceive as Nirmanakaya tulku, and in which way do you experience it? And if I relate to that in my own way, is it my deluded perception that there is an experience of suffering at all? I guess that's my question.
Dunga Soja Yorebe Yana, Tropical Namba, Dunga, Namba Tamba, Dengatsu Trunang Samre.
When it's in a children Jusum did dance, Trugo did, Dunga Yugimanda. Dunga Banza. Children Jusum did dance, Hanging the Asia of that. Chugu Lungo Tugu Chulun Tusum Yede and Tugu Telebina and Pajadunga Yumaras, Dunga Yomarasta. Dunga Azukarsha Duzina, Dunga Soa Shoro, Dunga Soa, then Gazarda, Banza. Then that Dunga Yondu Mendoza. That in a dear Chulun Tusum Yede, Tuguma Jida, Tugusing in the Yorda, Ming Tugu dies. And another don't have shin do you? Aram really don't you, Shangola, don't you, sometime good, don't you. Yeah,
less. Well, if you're asking about the actual Nirmanakaya, that is one of the three kayas, part of the Trikaya. The Nirmanakaya that's part of the set of three, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, that Nirmanakaya does not suffer, because suffering is a sensation, one of the afflicted aggregates, which have been abandoned so therefore Nirmanakaya does not suffer. If you're asking about those who are called tulkus conventionally, such as myself, then, oh boy, do I suffer. I definitely suffer. You need have no worry. I suffer both in my own experience and in the experience of others.
I have.
In the perception of others, I should say.
We need to discuss. Yeah.
Thank you so much for teaching us today, Your Holiness, and it's wonderful to see you again. I wanted to go back to something that you said yesterday. You talked about playing with kleshas, a game, so that who would win, me or the klesha? And I hope to hear a little more about this. In my life and my formal practice right now, I think the obstacle is very much many blessings and not really being certain what to do. It's a kind of confusion with how to organize my time, and when I push against it, it wins, and when I let it go, it also wins. So I thought maybe your suggestion to play with it like a game might be very helpful to me and maybe to others to learn more about.
Organize Jeshin.
Organize Jeshin.
Did it? Chila Mamboyes, organize Jeshin.
Let it.
That give the house. Chila. Didn't you wish that? That Chila Mambo Tobe 2 years in a deep country organization. The Zinjon or Todam chasing Mendosra. Chilabra Todam. 다 질럽디 녀섬 다 질럽디다 라메 질럽이네 가르 질럽이네디 질럽체 질럽 도담 정게 될봐 테레자 질럽체 아주 거르바다 오네진
라서
나는 미르지 마서는 배 미베 가르쳐지 주연다 첨부해봐 미 남주 첨부해봐 망부제빈 될라 도담 정게 오르가나이저 정게디 민주연 보지 거르마다 미드가 미지기 제도 말봐 드네 뉴스안에 다 개치슈디 랑 chilab gyundeni kansa rangni eni karjwe rangi gyu chinge la bar chedni kada karjwe sem gyu chinge la bar chene eni ji ni karjwe geso kumbe do cha tinde jing bezu chegwa da kechim shara sha te ma jona eni zamzam karjwe dire sa jorma 다 뒤에가 그러나 드레자죠 domtimen dangme der dangja sa da ba ji xie xian zheng me domtimen dangme der dangja sa la
domti sa na
da de ngen je xie
la sa
domti是da domti ma xie na pa yue dang sem de ji shi du pa yue sa jo ba sem ge kurang ge rang yun de ni kan sa sem be pa yue de xi xin da sem ge yun de quality
la sa
dao zi me be yin na 당매 때단다스 개와 사예비네 개와 사샤바디 다보 장기 데 에네 미게베 다보 잡용다 아니 개베 다보 장 하고 말았어 베나 다보 메베 때르지 비게 샤쉐비나 디 에네 디바지 이케용다 개와지 이케용 하고 말았어 내가 나 다나 생아주 바요의 제시라 수업에게 에네 다보 가셔야지 셈 다보 마제비나 참참 가셔야 소소 개조 사바디 에너지 땡 개와 드베 땡 루지텔라 마미 비치 개와 드베 땡 마미 바 미고 드베 땡 민도 용고레스 다나 실럽디 조 바지 드리앙노 아마지 실럽 망보 예스 킨사스도 어야 아들이 루사네 실럽 망보 예베 이나야
라서
다디 오르가나이저 제고나 소소 년 당보랑 런유 친기랍네 알바 에너지 런유데 파이어베 시디 파이어로 제버지 이제 계속 공부해봐 이제 가사 지기 에너지 럽디 오르가나이즈 아디야 오르가나이즈 라체도 오면도네 미신다리 야샤는 야샤는 you can land
라서 it sounds as though you have the sensation or the feeling of having received great blessings, but you're unsure of how to organize them into a practical, accessible format. In order to organize them, you need to gather more blessings, but you do this by blessing your own being through the cultivation of virtue. The need for further blessings in order to organize and care for the blessings you've received is very much like the need a person who has many properties has for a caretaker or organizer who can take care of all of them. So bless your own being through the accumulation of further virtue. There is a saying about this. It said, without governance, one's virtues are like a treasure without an owner. Governance in this case refers to a circumspection, care, and the faculty of mind which is the attentive and vigilance with regard to one's virtues. If one lacks this governance, then even though one may accumulate virtues, then they will be uncared for, left to be so that anything can happen to them, like a treasure that is left without an owner or a guardian, so that anyone could pick it up, could be picked up by someone with a virtuous intention or someone with an unvirtuous intention. So even though one may have received many, many blessings, one needs to organize them by blessing one's own being through a circumspection. he says things and he's joking, and I don't know if he's just trying to make fun of me or if he wants me to translate it. But then at the end he said, or you could try borrowing an organization from somebody who is super organized.
Naresh?
Two questions, Your Holiness. In the choice of a person as the object of compassion, can it be oneself? Is it appropriate?
The trewa nidos, trewa dampo de dampo ninje ke megyo rang la zona drege ke.
Rang la.
La so. Rang la. Yes, if you can feel compassion for yourself.
The second question about subtle mind and subtle wind being one indivisible entity. The mind, as we know, is not amenable to the senses, no color, no taste, etc. Clear knowing, and definitely never heard that it possesses motility or movement. Now, prana, subtle, howsoever subtle it may be, would demonstrate some kind of particle aspect, I imagine, or its aspect dissimilar to the mind.
Okay.
Now, I'm just wondering, two things which demonstrate such divergent characteristics, how do we see them to be one indivisible entity?
The longsem shindo tawa ke kola.
Dangi hagos.
Las.
Guzeba jadu.
Las.
Korang timse ba yin sang adon yin zoma jandi ba.
Las.
다들 간데 다르지 않아서요. 예, 당연히 라이브 되게 디 셈레야 카도메 이메 다카카메 데레 이난 게 당게 사데 배낭 아주 유배는 배 가서래 배 가서 로유도 시그러 봐. 시작.
시작. 라스.
가서다 베네셈게 다 유도 섬아 도로 봐.
라서.
도도 산에 아니 그 시바데 유를 주고로 봐. 말왜?
라리.
아니 시바 유를 주고도 산다데 주베 차스나다 요에 차 델리아 아니 가서다 심 다셔르만 다디 심 코랑 가서다 심 코랑 요디 왜 기지 가마르다 가다 조디 ene sheba yulen jobe charo dilchi chane dasha 그러지 마도 아 디요 이베 기스베
It's true that the mind itself has no color or shape and so forth, but nevertheless the mind thinks, and thinking is a type of action or movement or change. And the mind thinking is how the mind enters into or interacts with objects of mind, objects of knowledge. And it is that entry into its objects, the mind's entry into objects, that is being referred to here as movement, or motion. It does not mean the movement of the mind from one place to another, like a physical entity.
Lady in the back.
I'm reading out a line from the sheet that we got yesterday. It says, at 24, the 17th Karmappa shares the concerns of his generation, peace, feminism, the environment. I'm drawing courage from this line. I'm asking a question as a woman. In a political struggle for justice, rights and fairness, one has to wage a fight with even the people you love. I know what I have to do, so I'm not even asking what needs to be done. But the confusion is that there is Tara, the goddess of compassion, and there is Durga, Chamanda, and a host of other Hindu goddesses who fight evil. How does one reconcile these two, what I see as dualities?
gosa nyamba ge kola tene data de konge kari zogopa shegetos de kola kan shogi yomares de bumage chedonso tene de choga don gosa nyamba toya la zamzong shenda rang la tsewa yana tene te zoba jago de zo hako getos inang data pela shaba yana pena flamo regla Lamo Shiva Jitsun drama, ne tukji dangi chendang, yena lamo tets dramo, dena dene Durga dang, dene chamun de la sopa ke, dene lamo dramo, dene megawa chok jomba la dramo yamba ke, nika yores, deni tetsam namba kaka rao tsogidos.
Taka nazodi, namba kaka nazodi, tena yega dizikajo.
What about the disparity in aspect between goddesses like Tara and goddesses like Durga? What is your concern about the disparity in aspect?
How do you show compassion to the ones you know you're going to cause suffering to the ones against whom you're fighting?
Right.
The Samsung Shena Tsupa Japa Kapsayang, Tene de Shola, Consola Dunga Tets Youngers, Maropo. Yinang, Consola Ninja Chibo.
Oh, Tanya Hozon. Tata will go in Zon is that it? Nino. Tada Chidangi Takashuraji Shive Duana Shiva Shive number and Chabu Duana Chabu number. Not there, Kashura, dual Chavedun, Simson that dual Chavedun, Ran Susu, the Kashuraji, Simson Susu. Negative Sabe, negative Sabe, Jukulia, Sinar, Digi, was a young child. Today, do Tabazi Moneji Zawe Kashureta. That Teambe Zo Konazu, Chabukur Shimba Tea, and it's Zawadi Kashre, Rabati Kasa. Niji Chambo. That you go some. You go on Niji Chambo, Niji Chambotia, Taz and Niji Chambo Kashuretaji, Ninjas, Niji Chambo Sala Mero, Niji Surdo maybe Niji, Shendum Basisabi Niji, Randon Kizza Maja, Degada, Shendum Basisabi Niji Chet. And do you go on Niji Tawati Gundalan and Shen, Dujade and Dugo? The day of Indusa, tea turned and a veggie with Karjuradaji, Travel Nabalashine, and a six of Maguina, the Karjaguina, the Chaji Orba, that Teko, Karjuradaji, Chojentico, to the neck of Kashalia, the Samboy of the Yores. By Yemina, Kashre, there's Perubot in Dugawati, do it Tula Power. Hakwane, the Chaurmado, do it Tula Mama, the Gas, can you the Gas and go Niji Guinala, Sheshabadea, go turn to Gomata, Pingomata, Mission that Dungeser. Mission that Dungeser in a Tundal, do you ever Tula Power Simbina? I was the Magic Amas. That they are go Niji Shimbu, Guinala, this one.
To answer your question with reference to the iconography that you mentioned, in general the display of a peaceful aspect by
a microsystem in ecology or something like that, I have a feeling with big stones that when someone breaks a big stone, is something like I feel wrong about that, you know. So I would like to have kind of more explanations about that feeling, or if we should kind of feel compassion to stones, or you know, because it's really a strong feeling about something is going wrong with that.
That derela, da ninje chebe ke kapsa dambo mekyote shingdong la soba yena dregere so. Da korange dene do chembo yaba de so la pema se zowa chembo yores. Do chembo. Pawang. La re pawang do. Dene me che ke pawang shikna mo sen dunga zowa dos.
Oho.
Den son dene do chembo de so la meka. Dene ninje kom la dregere.
Do chambari mean?
Lare.
Na? Jelo penju je na ta tamje peju dan ko ta.
Laso.
Te chamba de ni jar pengu do na.
Laso.
Mala pena chi na chi se jo marwe.
Laso.
Mala pengi do na chi na chu chu sa ji xia yo da. Azu pebebel.
Laso.
Peba de zu tamber jo de le ya ne be. Har ji dan chi se du san du ja zgro ba. Ina mala pengi do na ane chi na chu chu. Ta kan de du san ne. Chamba de ni jar pen do na ta do ina karina.
Laso. If it works for you, if it actually helps you to develop compassion, then it is fine. Oh, sorry. If it works for you, if it actually helps you to develop compassion, then of course it is fine to focus on boulders or large stones, large rocks, and so on, because by the very fact that it works for you, it's achieving its purpose. So therefore, it's fine. There's a saying in Tibetan, if it improves the quality of the butter, one may even add dog fat.
Yes.